see me? Quote, at a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability, and I could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm and stern rebuke, for it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened, the conscience of the nation must be roused, the propriety of the nation must be startled, the hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. End quote. Frederick Douglass, 1852. The function of exculpatory tropes in the telling of My Lai's story. My Lai. The My Lai massacre, originally referred to in rumors as the Pinkville Massacre, was the killing of over 500 non-resisting villagers, including children and babies, by U.S. soldiers of the 1st Battalion's Charlie Company in San My Village, Quang Ngai Province, Vietnam, on March 16, 1968. Along with torture, mutilation, and at least 20 rapes, the massacre resulted in the complete destruction of village buildings and wells. Named after the mistaken label on a military map of San My, colloquially, the term My Lai also refers to a military cover-up following the massacre. The culturally distributed public understanding of the massacre, cover-up, and related issues are herein referred to as the My Lai story. The way this story is told functions to rehabilitate the institution of war. Based on the discourse around the massacre, the American public might blame Vietnamese guerrilla tactics, bad military leadership, bad apples among the troops. We might even blame the particular kind of war that was waged in Vietnam, but never the phenomenon of war itself. Ironically, considering the initial cover-up, the event is well represented in documentary records, mostly thanks to published military investigations, such as the Peers Commission's report, and congressional hearings, all of which were held by entities with either explicitly martial values or some other interest in protecting the institution of war, and all of which rely heavily on the testimonies of killers and the few witnesses and resistors they outnumber. Documents also exist thanks to ambiguous figures like Army photographer Ron Haberly, whose stark color photos of dead and mutilated bodies were vital to publicizing the massacre, but who also destroyed negatives showing individual soldiers committing atrocities. I opened my net wide on this one, hoping to learn about the story of the My Lai massacre as a gestalt object at work in a culturally distributed way on American public memory. This meant considering all the ways the story is told, written about, portrayed in documentary cinema, or even sung. The tellings and analyses I encountered from works of philosophy to television documentaries and talk shows were remarkably similar in certain specific ways, and patterns emerged in those similarities that I could trace back to the only significant sources for information on the atrocity, the explanations given by the murderers themselves in legal and ethical self-defense. Often, each grim fact of the story was accompanied by a matching, tailor-made excuse, right there in the text of the document. It occurred to me early that contradictions and internal tension, deriving from the use of American subjectivity to frame and plot the narrative of what happened in San My Village, might interfere with our ability to hold the proper forces and institutions accountable, and ultimately with our ability to understand the event in a global context or from a world historical perspective. Somehow, this murder of hundreds of people in Vietnam is experienced by the American public as an American tragedy, a painfully traumatic psychic tragedy of guilt and feigned bafflement. Whatever stories we're telling ourselves about this event, the effect is to produce a kind of diffused, self-indulgent paroxysm of moral confusion. There's a cast of characters, villains and heroes. Excuse me. In tellings of the My Lai story, a few names emerge as emblems. We have our villains: Captain Ernest Medina, the man who gave the orders; Lieutenant William Calley, the man who enjoyed the killing; conflicted killer Private First Class Paul Meadlow. Above them, vaguely menacing patriarchs like Lieutenant Colonel Frank A. Barker, the commander of Charlie Company, whose tactics purportedly set the stage for atrocities. General William Westmoreland also looms. Behind them, the Army, Washington, out-of-reach institutional scapegoats, the swamp of it all, conceptual sinkholes where accountability goes to die. These versus our heroes, Major Hugh Thompson, the noble helicopter pilot whose conscience was even stronger than his patriotism. Former infantryman Ron Ridenour, another veteran of helicopter missions, who followed his dark suspicions until he had enough information to blow the whistle on the massacre and cover-up. Army photographer Ron Haberly, whose personal color photos of the dead forced the U.S. public to confront the horrible crimes committed in their name. Sergeant Michael Bernhard, who likely resisted orders to kill civilians. Even General William Peers himself enters the narrative as a disapproving father, a general who arrives to enforce orderly discipline with an honorable heart. All of the men in both groups were soldiers in the U.S. military, and with the possible but unlikely exception of Haberly, all of them have blood on their hands, either directly or indirectly. Martial values. The sources of evidence we use to build a story are the first factor determining the locus of meaning in whatever narrative we produce. In his vital work, Silencing the Past, Michel Rolfe Trouillot cautions us that silences in accounts of history, that is, gaps or omissions, can and in fact must enter the record almost immediately. Often enough, these omissions are the result of unconscious biases or cultural blind spots on the part of historians or others recording, making the initial records. Silences are not the only way to obscure history, however. A loud cacophony of voices functions just as well to drown out other voices and perspectives. If the account of an event can be stacked with one kind of information from one kind of source, there will be little room for anything else. In the case of Millet, a loud chorus of military perspectives drowns out other interpretations. Our cast of characters is drawn entirely from the ranks of the United States Army. The initial records in this case were, without exceptions, produced by military men. The very first reports from the Army on the actions of Charlie Company on March 16, 1968, were lies of a common sort produced by military journalists and distributed to paint a rosy picture of the war. It was the martial agenda of the Army that set the priorities of the journalists who laid the first stratum of written evidence. Once the Department of Defense was forced to acknowledge that an atrocity had taken place, communication with the public was dominated by attempts to manipulate opinion rather than to inform. Efforts by the state and defense departments to pursue justice were intentionally leaked or publicized to demonstrate that action was being taken. This performance of symbolic accountability put an early stamp on the discourse. When the Army began seriously investigating the incident via the Peers Commission, they questioned the men of Charlie Company from the perspective of the institution they represented. Premises rooted in military traditions and martial values informed many of the actions and statements of killers, whistleblowers, and investigators alike. The values of an institution like the Army are not universal. The questions a general wants answered are not the questions a nurse or a philosophy professor or a civilian prosecutor, for that matter, might ask. They are certainly not the only questions a historian should be asking. Additionally, the motivations of the men answering the questions must be part of any analysis. They were being investigated for war crimes. They embedded their defense in their descriptions of facts. Unfortunately, the message coming across in popularly accessible media like TV documentaries, magazine articles, and introductory books for students focuses overwhelmingly on the subjective experiences of Americans who committed hundreds of acts of murder and dozens of rapes. This turns the My Lai story into a psychological drama that can easily be fitted into an American literary idiom. When communicating a drama, storytellers use tropes to orient readers and to establish a framework for interpretation. Historians and writers offered such a glut of pathos and morbid interest will, of course, be tempted to produce picturesque narratives in a highly publishable register. A practiced bullshitter can construct a powerful story out of tropes steeped in martial values. Everyone who appears in the narrative to either assign guilt or praise valor comes from within the U.S. military. In my view, there is something vile in the irony of giving people medals for managing not to kill weeping children in a ditch. Using sincere tones of reverence for any element of it. The whistleblowers, the power of Haverly's photos The heroism of Hugh Thompson and other helicopter crewmen, it strikes me as shallow and grotesque. 500 murders. Baby corpses in photos taken at a certain distance are somewhat easier to look at than the corpses of adults. They look like discarded dolls, even when blown apart, whereas the gore of an adult corpse is unmistakable and horrifying. Remember, on March 16th, 1968, American soldiers in Vietnam murdered over 500 non-resisting people in Son My village, including babies. I mention the babies because babies were murdered with bullets and bayonets, while some of their mothers were mutilated alive on the paths between their gardens. And these are important elements of the story. Judging by the number of pages in the discourse that are dedicated to the feelings and motivations of the killers, one might be forgiven for thinking this is a story about the American soul or some other nonsense. It has been frustrating wading through the source material. I've begun to resent the background of tawdry mistakes, forcing us to call an atrocity that occurred in a place called Son My the My Lai massacre, if we want to be understood. And I can only take a minimum of consolation from the fact that we don't still call it the Pinkville massacre. I'm frustrated with the kinds of sources that are available to historians and almost angry at how accessible they are, in fact. By the time I understood how they'd been used, I didn't want to go through them. They're overrepresented. We lose sight of the 500 murders at the center of the story, partly because testimonials from U.S. soldiers make up such a huge majority of the material, and partly because their form is inherently sympathetic and there's no effective counterbalance. The same process of dehumanization applied to the villagers of Son My by the soldiers of Charlie Company is replayed by a reader, going over their excuses time and again. Repetition alone builds a kind of gravity around ideas. Even when a historian draws from these sources the testimonials of murderers, in order to condemn the actions taken by the killers in the most critical spirit possible, the story is still saturated with American subjectivity. For the American public to learn from what happened at Son My, historians must find ways to complicate or disturb narratives focused heavily on the reasons American soldiers gave for slaughtering non-resistant villagers, and present the massacre that happened there as a consequence of disproportionate violence and war. This means abandoning tropes drawn from the excuses soldiers gave for their behavior, or at the very least, drawing sharp critical attention to their use. Genealogy of a trope. Once established, tropes allow us to communicate whole constellations of concepts quickly without explicitly drawing them all out. It's a bit like data compression. Tropes are shortcuts for writers and other storytellers. They allow us to pack our prose with subtext and interest beyond the words themselves by linking them to larger conceptual frameworks. Every story has a cast of characters. The My Lai story is full of human personalities. The tropes that have emerged in the discourse around My Lai come directly from the testimony of American soldiers, most of whom are speaking to authorities investigating war crimes. The testimony was shaped by the defensiveness of the individuals testifying. This tends to give them an exculpatory quality in general. The soldiers all speak American English with usages and references that are familiar to American audiences. Tropes constructed from their explanations are easy to present in a familiar contemporary American idiom. This means their use in secondary sources as discrete narrative objects to be plugged into the story wherever they might fit allows for a cheap but potent emotional engagement with an American audience. Nearly every time an instance of violence against civilians is mentioned in the background or introductory section of a book, in an article, or an essay, it is framed beside an exculpatory trope drawn from the humanizing, subjective testimony of a soldier in Charlie Company. So we're taking all of our explanations from what the guys told us. As objects, the exculpatory tropes I've identified can be used alone or in variously effective combinations. In the next section, I'll identify and describe a few of the most common patterns my investigation uncovered. Institutional failure / special war. Institutional failure is the essential excuse that the first group of tropes all boil down to. The largest institutional failure of them all being the particular set of policies that emerged to define the Vietnam War as a special war. A uniquely evil war, and critically a unique mistake in the policy of American military intervention. This trope is used to implicitly argue that the massacre was caused by a failure of 1. Training, 2. Leadership, or 3. Communication. failure of those things, rather than that it was caused by the success of those factors. It's never posited, for example, that Captain Medina and other leaders in Charlie Company successfully communicated their intentions to the men under their command by holding the briefing for the My Lai operation immediately after a highly emotional memorial service for 3 recently killed members of the company. It's never suggested that bayonet training focused on the spirit of killing, quote, the spirit of killing, end quote, was successful at preparing the men to stab children. Historians must not be naive or blind to subtext. We can't let Army apologists tautologically define anything bad as a failure of their values, when evidence shows that their values are perfectly expressed by bad things, like rape and murder. Taking excuses offered by soldiers and officers themselves at face value allows an injection of martial values into the history-making process that switches off our normal critical drive to question explanations offered by highly motivated stakeholders trying to protect the institutions that they serve. When the Army insists that, given the right circumstances, atrocities are inevitable, we must remind them that war is the circumstance. The specialness of My Lai is asserted often and unequivocally by everyone from Army leadership to scholars of ethics. According to George Kotkin, what makes My Lai morally abhorrent and fascinating relative to civilian bombing deaths is that the killing was done at close range and without apparent necessity. End quote. First, in my view, identifying an atrocity as fascinating, whatever debatable truth there is to such a claim, is self-indulgent, a style tick that should be avoided for the sake of clarity. Still, for historical and aesthetic reasons, the My Lai massacre stands out to Americans as having extra interest as a narrative. Narratives share certain elements of structure that can be used to influence the interpretation of events. Over and over, we're told about the poor and hasty training Charlie Company received regarding the Geneva Conventions and prisoner handling. Infantryman Herbert Carter recalled that his instructions on how to handle prisoners humanely were delivered by his instructor with scornful laughter. The leadership culture was reported as racist and hostile. Testimony contains reports of dehumanizing language used by officers, and of course the official policy of free fire zones, where anyone or anything or anyone present was designated an enemy combatant, communicated to the men of Charlie Company the indiscriminate nature of targeting protocols, as did the racist mere blank policy, which defined every Vietnamese casualty a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army fighter. In terms of leadership, the greatest failure is represented by Captain Medina, the most direct supervisor on the scene. Medina reportedly provided a bad example to the soldiers under his command, in part by allowing his frustration with the local civilians to show up in the use of dehumanizing metaphors and violence. Another example of Medina's poor leadership was his reported tendency to give vague orders. We're told that vague orders were particularly dangerous because, as Private Paul Meadlow testified, soldiers in Charlie Company had been so effectively trained to strictly follow orders, especially in combat situations. Okay. Okay, the next trope is our boys. A major problem with getting Americans to view this episode from a world historical or even neutral perspective is the simple fact that the experiences of the killers themselves are delivered as compelling stories in a familiar idiom. American readers relate to the perspectives of Americans. In a sense, they are representative of us all. We focus attention on those young men because of the moral complexities with which they struggled. Quote. Many assumptions and assertions that appear in tellings of the My Lai story rely on the premise that the young men who killed that day were normal. That's a quote. The young men who killed that day were normal. In my research, I watched 2 documentaries on My Lai produced for television. Both built stories early on of the men as a good multiracial cross-section of the American population. There were long segments dense with emotional descriptions of individual deaths. Each U.S. serviceman gets a highly personal death, described in great detail. The films use cinematic techniques, music, and montage to present compelling reasons for the hate Charlie Company felt toward Vietnamese civilians. Filmmakers like Barack Goldman and Kevin Sim carefully introduce us to the men with happy recollections of their basic training in Hawaii and stock images of soldiers interacting as comrades. This trope is omnipresent in tellings of the My Lai story. It pops up woven into and around all the other tropes. The pulse of every story is built on the audience's identification with the Americans whose testimonies provide all the emotional content. Our boys are the ones who were failed by the institutions of the army. Our boys are the ones traumatized into anomie by loss. Our boys are out there struggling against the dirty tactics of the Viet Cong. And of course, there's a touch of the Our Boys trope implicated in the special war trope, because it must be a special war if it could drive our boys to do such horrible things. But this notion is patently false. From Sand Creek in the Indian Wars to Biscari and other massacres during World War II to Haditha in Iraq, American soldiers commit war crimes and sometimes superlatively brutal atrocities every time they're sent to war. Another somewhat surprising expression of this trope is in the presentation of performances of regret. The fact that the killers are shown interviewed in documentaries, visibly haunted by their memories, unlucky, miserable, weeping, only serves to further humanize them and to offer audiences avenues for catharsis and relief from the tension of guilt and horror. See how sorry our boys are for what they did. It's evidence of their goodness, which was only perverted by institutional failure, and the anomie it produced. Absorbing the My Lai story as a single object unfolding chronologically, we can follow an emotional narrative that shows the remarkably straightforward, if guarded, testimonies of young men become the pathos-drenched confessions of their middle-aged husks. The Our Boys trope is used to center American sensibilities and tellings of the My Lai story to American audiences. It hyperhumanizes U.S. soldiers, especially compared to the dehumanized Vietnamese people who appear in the story only as mute sufferers or hidden enemies. This results in receptivity to interpretations that favor the humanized Americans at the expense of moral clarity. Viet Cong bad sports. Next trope. The implication or the outright assertion that the NVA and the VC fought dirty or used unethical tactics against the Americans is a central and vital part of the explanation complex that emerged from the martial values of the military men who produced all the documents American historians and others use to understand the massacre. Of course, true warriors prefer a fair fight in the open to ambushes and traps. Anyone would lose patience with an enemy that broke the rules, especially if the rules would make the war unwinnable for one's opponent. In most My Lai tellings, Charlie Company's casualties are wrenched from them with no potential for self-defense, let alone retaliation. There were no visible borders or enemies. Often the only indication that they were on hostile soil came when one of them was shot by an invisible sniper or stepped on a booby trap, end quote. Fueled by frustration fueled sinister, seething hatred. Even in works more broadly treating the Vietnam War, when the subject of My Lai comes up, the story veers into subjective descriptions of the Americans' experiences of frustration and injustice, into subjective experiences of the Americans' experiences of frustration and injustice of Viet Cong attacks. I have to fix that sentence. Only rarely is some analysis of guerrilla tactics as a barely legitimate tactic of armed resistance to invasion permitted into the discourse. These are some sentences we have written some sentences. In documents released to the public, nameless military analysts tell us that VC fighters lived with locals, quote, to conceal their presence, and that they used women and children to place bombs. Contemporary write-ups in the military press reflecting on the massacre tell us that in Quang Ngai province, the enemy had little or no respect for the law of land warfare and did not play by what we consider the rules. This is perhaps the most damaging of the tropes because it hums along in the background, silently justifying atrocity by implication. You can say, as Riley does, that leaders must maintain a strong commitment to morality in spite of tests. But the message received is that the VC put themselves out of balance by conducting their guerrilla war, and in a sense, the local population had it coming. Of course, our enemy is not obliged to fight the kind of war we find it easy to win. Framing war as a game and the VC or NVA as the first side to abandon the rules of the game goes very far toward the end of diffusing outrage at U.S. actions. Why should we follow the Geneva Conventions when the VC used snipers against our soldiers? As a First side 2. First side 2. Yeah. Okay, why should we be following the Geneva Conventions when they are booby trapping us? Uh-huh. In My Lai tellings, local civilians might be characterized as treacherous. Cowardly snipers justify retaliation against civilians. In my view, armed soldiers are a legitimate target, especially to people defending their homeland. Non-resisting villagers, for example, are not legitimate targets. Cinematic documentaries are particularly guilty of using the bad sports trope to maximum narrative effect, especially in combination with the Our Boys trope. As I watched one film, the American Experience television documentary, I was conscious of becoming suspicious of the villagers as portrayed on screen, to the effect of, well, maybe some of them were working with the enemy. In spite of my conscious sympathy lying firmly with civilians, I felt myself influenced by cinematic and narrative cues to suspect and resent their role in the story of the young boys I'd come to know. Reject the villager's role. To resent the villager's role. In the story of the young boys I'd come to know. Boys who are so frank and earnest and soft-spoken when admitting to murder, clearly conflicted about what they've done. The story of these boys would be so much more comfortable if the villagers were somehow culpable. The part of a viewer that wants a sensible and satisfying story keeps seeking interpretations that otherize or dehumanize the villagers. Documentaries like this are how history reaches the curious lay thinkers in a contemporary society. The kinds of people who watch these documentaries likely talk about them, they modify and repeat the arguments and views and deploy the frameworks described and set by narrative or cinematic tropes. Scholars of history should interfere with low-quality popular accounts of important past events. We should make our own. The main implications of the bad sports trope is that the Vietnamese people were all put in danger by the actions of the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, and of course by their own actions. It functions to divert blame to an imaginary point morally upstream of the men who committed the massacre, a point where somebody else broke the rules and opened the door to dirty tactics. In my view, if you can't fight without breaking the laws of war or committing atrocities, then you can't win and must withdraw. It's not your opponent's job to choose a method of war that suits you. The NVA and Viet Cong didn't slaughter any towns of American civilians in their war against America. Guerrilla tactics like snipers and booby traps targeted armed U.S. soldiers. In no way was their guerrilla war an example of bad sportsmanship, and in no way did the Vietnamese deserve civilian massacres because the VC used traps and snipers. Next trope is trauma, loss, enemy. Quote, this is a quote, "By March, the mood of Charlie Company was decidedly ugly. Long patrols, gnawing discomforts, and mounting casualties had taken their toll. Morale was low, and the men complained that they had been singled out for the worst duties. The level of unsanctioned violence against Vietnamese civilians increased." End quote. This passage, from an introduction to the massacre written for history students, illustrates both the care with which the emotional experiences of the killers are handled, and the usual proximity in text between the excuse and the crime. In the book of essays Facing My Lai, Chapter 8, Individuals in the Trauma of War, is entirely focused on the effects of trauma on the behavior of soldiers and veterans. Arguments are made that perpetrators and other active participants in atrocities face more severe manifestations of disorders like PTSD than survivors and witnesses. If true, this has interest, but I must argue that its ready inclusion in many manifestations of the My Lai story contributes to a gestalt effect of dissipating accountability. Trauma is linked with enemy. Somewhere in the shuffle, accountability dissolves. When told that Charlie Company's journey to My Lai was no doubt made possible by the losses they had previously experienced, emphasis on losses mine, it's a simple matter for a reader to connect a few dots. The VC are responsible for Charlie Company losses. The losses made the massacre possible. Therefore, the VC are responsible for making the massacre possible. American losses are communicated movingly in testimonies given to the Pierce Commission. Men linger on the deaths of friends in the weeks before the slaughter and on grisly experiences of death and mutilation by landmine. Even a South Vietnamese source, Tran Ngoc Tan, a local district chief asked by the South Vietnamese government to investigate reports of an atrocity in Son My, mentions the losses from booby traps as a reason for the killing. So this South Vietnamese guy who's like, why did this happen, or did this happen? He's like, I think they did it because we killed so many other guys. Even that kind of creeps in. We're told how the men had been trained only trust one another, and that even children could be enemies. As the story unfolds, it's only as casualties mounted that Charlie Company demanded revenge. Enemy is outlined in text, explicitly formulated as an excuse. These frustrated kids are shown far from America and the culture they know, which would normally keep them accountable. I think I'm going to pause.